The moment a man realizes he misunderstood someone is the moment everything changes. Germany, spring 1945. The rain fell in a thin, steady line, soft enough to be ignored, constant enough to be felt. It coated everything: the broken rooftops, the cracked cobblestone streets, the silence that hung over what used to be a town. At the edge of a narrow road, just beyond a collapsed church tower, a temporary American checkpoint stood like a pause in time. Sandbags, a canvas tent, a wooden table with papers weighed down by a metal canteen. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just order, placed carefully into the middle of ruin. A line of civilians waited under the gray sky, their figures still, their faces unreadable. Among them stood Anna Weiss. 26 years old. Thin but not fragile. Her coat hung loosely on her shoulders, damp from the rain, her hands resting quietly at her sides. She did not look around. She did not whisper to the others. She simply stood. Waiting. Observing. As if she understood something the rest had not yet noticed. Captain William Carter stood across from the line, just under the edge of the tent where the rain couldn't quite reach him. 34. From Ohio. His uniform was clean despite the mud around him, boots planted firmly, gloves still on. He had done this 100 times already. Check papers. Ask questions. Move them along. Routine. Efficient. Necessary. He glanced at his wristwatch. 2:07 p.m. The second hand moved. Steady. Predictable. Unlike everything else in this country. Next, he said, his voice flat, not raised, not harsh. Just a command shaped into a word. Anna stepped forward. One step. Then another. Measured. Controlled. She stopped exactly where she was supposed to. Not too close. Not too far. Carter didn't look at her right away. He reached for the documents first, flipping through them with practiced indifference. German identification. Civilian records. Nothing unusual. Nothing important. Another name. Another face. Another person passing through a system designed to process thousands. He spoke without looking up, his English quick, clipped. Name. No pause. No adjustment. No attempt to simplify. He assumed what he always assumed. That she would not understand. That someone else would translate. That silence would follow. It usually did. The rain tapped lightly against the canvas above them. A drop slipped through the edge and landed on the table, spreading slowly into the grain of the wood. Carter waited, already preparing his next question. Then she answered. Anna Weiss. Her voice was calm. Clear. Not loud. Not hesitant. The kind of voice that didn't try to prove anything. It simply existed. Carter's hand stopped on the page. Not dramatically. Just stopped. The second hand on his watch kept moving. He looked up. Really looked this time. Her eyes met his, not challenging, not submissive. Just steady. He held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary. Then he nodded once, almost reflexively. Place of residence, he continued, still in English. Still at the same pace. Still expecting the rhythm to break. It didn't. Leipzig. Before the bombing. Same tone. Same control. No excess emotion. Just information. Clean. Precise. Around them, the air seemed to shift, not louder, not tense, just different. As if something invisible had moved into the space between them. Carter blinked once. A small delay. Barely noticeable. But enough. He adjusted the papers in his hand, though they didn't need adjusting. His glove brushed against the edge of the table, leaving a faint streak of moisture. Occupation, he said. This time, the word came a fraction slower. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But he noticed. She did too. Teacher, she replied. A brief pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, languages. Carter's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in discomfort. In recognition. The kind that arrives quietly, without asking permission. He had expected silence, confusion, dependence. Instead, he was standing in front of someone who had understood every word from the beginning and chosen not to interrupt. The rain continued. Soft. Steady. Unimpressed by the shift it had just witnessed. Carter removed his glove. Slowly. Not because he had to. Because something in the moment required it. He placed it on the table beside the papers, the leather darkening as it absorbed the moisture. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same authority. But something underneath it had changed. Not weaker. Not softer. Just aware. How long have you been in the area, Miss Weiss? And for the first time that afternoon, he waited for the answer, instead of assuming it would not come. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was difficult, but because it had been asked differently. Anna noticed it first, the shift so small it could have been dismissed, but she did not dismiss things easily. She had learned not to. Since February, she answered, her voice carrying the same quiet steadiness, untouched by the rain or the tension that had just passed between them. I was relocated from Dresden. Carter gave a slight nod, his eyes moving briefly back to the paper, but not in the same way as before. He was no longer scanning. He was verifying. There was a difference. He wrote something down, the pencil pressing just a little harder than necessary, leaving an indentation in the paper that would remain even after the ink faded. Around them, the line behind Anna remained silent, but not indifferent. People noticed things like this, even when they did not understand them. A pause. A tone. The way one person chose to stand, and the way another chose to respond. Carter cleared his throat, a quiet, almost unnecessary sound. You speak English well, he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. Anna tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement. I was trained to, she replied. No elaboration. No story attached. Just a fact, offered without decoration. The rain shifted direction for a moment, carried by a light wind, tapping softly against the side of the tent. Carter glanced outward, then back at her. Something about the way she answered made it difficult to continue in the same rhythm he had used all day. He adjusted again, though there was nothing left to adjust. What did you learn? He asked. This time, the question did not come as quickly. Anna's gaze moved briefly past him, toward the road behind the checkpoint, where water collected in shallow dips along the uneven ground. At the university, she said, before it closed. A small pause followed. Not empty. Just complete. Carter nodded once more, slower now, as if each piece of information carried more weight than expected. He had spoken to dozens of civilians that afternoon. Names, towns, occupations. It all blended together. But this did not blend. This stayed. He reached for the next form, but his hand hesitated halfway. Not because he forgot what to do. Because for the first time, the process felt incomplete. He looked at her again, directly, without the filter of routine. Do you have family in the area? The question was standard. It appeared on the form in front of him. But the way he asked it was not. Anna met his eyes, her expression unchanged, but something in the stillness of her face suggested consideration rather than reflex. No, she said. One word. Final. Carter held the silence for a second longer than protocol required. Then he nodded, placing the paper down carefully instead of sliding it aside. The small difference did not go unnoticed. He reached for his glove, then stopped, leaving it where it was. The leather had darkened further, the rain having soaked deeper into it. He did not put it back on. You will proceed to the next station, he said, his tone steady, but no longer distant. Anna inclined her head slightly. Not a bow. Not submission. Just acknowledgement. She turned, her steps as measured as before, and moved past him toward the far side of the checkpoint. Carter watched her for a moment. Not long enough to draw attention. just long enough to register something he could not immediately define. Then he looked down at the line again. Next, he called out. The words sounded the same, but it did not feel the same. The rain eased as the afternoon stretched forward, not stopping, just thinning into something lighter, almost forgettable, like a sound that had been there so long it no longer demanded attention. Anna moved toward the next station without hesitation, her steps steady across the damp ground, her shoes leaving faint impressions that filled slowly with water behind her. The second table was smaller, less formal, manned by a young corporal who looked up. Only briefly as she approached. He asked fewer questions, checked fewer details, marked her papers with a quick motion of his pen and gestured her through with a nod that carried no weight beyond routine. She continued walking, past the edge of the checkpoint, toward the open road that stretched between broken buildings and quiet fields. She did not look back. Behind her, Captain William Carter remained where he was, though the line had shortened and the rhythm of the checkpoint had begun to return to something resembling normal. He processed the next few civilians with the same words, the same structure, the same measured tone. But something was off. Not enough to disrupt the system. Just enough that he noticed it. He asked a question, received an answer, wrote it down, moved on. Efficient. Correct. And yet, each exchange felt slightly delayed, as if his mind arrived a second later than his voice. At one point, he asked a man for his place of residence twice, not because he had not heard the answer, but because he had not registered it. The man repeated himself, slower this time, watching Carter with quiet confusion. Carter nodded, wrote it down, and gestured him forward. The line ended. The space in front of the table emptied. The rain softened further, turning into a faint mist that hovered in the air rather than falling. Carter looked at his watch. 2:26 p.m. 19 minutes had passed since Anna stepped forward. It did not feel like 19 minutes. He removed the rest of his glove, placing it beside the first one, both now damp, both untouched since he set them down. He flexed his fingers slightly, as if testing something invisible. Then he looked out toward the road. The civilians who had passed through were already dispersing, their figures becoming smaller as they moved away from the checkpoint. Among them, he recognized her. Not by her face. Not by her clothing. But by the way she moved. Measured. Unhurried. As if she carried her own pace, unaffected by the world around her. She paused briefly near a shallow ditch where rainwater had collected, stepping around it without breaking stride, then continued forward. Carter watched for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked back at the table. The papers were stacked neatly. The forms complete. Everything in order. He reached for the top sheet, then stopped. His hand hovered above it, not touching. The system was still there. The process. The structure. But something had shifted within it. Not broken. Not replaced. Just adjusted. He leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that was almost silent. Around him, the checkpoint remained unchanged. The same tent. The same sandbags. The same road cutting through a quiet, wounded landscape. But the space between one question and the next had grown wider. More deliberate. As if each word now required a moment of consideration before it was spoken. Carter picked up his glove, turning it in his hand, watching how the leather had darkened where the rain had settled into it. He pressed his thumb against the surface, feeling the weight of the water absorbed within. Then he set it back down. Not putting it on. Not yet. He looked once more toward the road, though she was farther now, almost indistinguishable from the others. And for the first time that day, he did not call out for the next person immediately. He waited. Just a second. Long enough to notice the quiet. Long enough to feel it. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice steady, unchanged to anyone listening, but different in a way only he would recognize. Next. The afternoon settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, as if the checkpoint had returned to its script, but with a slight hesitation between each line. Carter continued his work, his voice steady, his posture unchanged, yet something in the space around him had shifted in a way that could not be measured or recorded. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only a faint dampness in the air, the kind that clung to fabric and skin without announcing itself. A breeze moved through the broken edges of the town, carrying the scent of wet wood and distant earth. Another civilian stepped forward. A middle-aged man, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes lowered in quiet compliance. Carter asked the questions. The man answered in German. A translator nearby repeated the responses in English. Everything followed the expected pattern. And yet, Carter found himself listening differently. Not just to the words, but to the pauses between them. The man hesitated before answering one question, glancing briefly at the ground before speaking. Carter noticed it. Before, he would have moved on, marking the form, continuing the line. Now, he waited half a second longer. Not enough to disrupt the flow. Just enough to acknowledge the hesitation. When the man finished, Carter gave a small nod. Not a command. Not approval. Just recognition. The man stepped away, his shoulders lifting slightly as he moved on. The next person approached. A woman older than the last, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Carter asked her name, then paused, just briefly, before the next question. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But it was there. He was no longer moving ahead of the person in front of him. He was moving with them. The line shortened again. The afternoon light shifted, breaking faintly through the clouds, casting a soft, diffused glow over the checkpoint. It was not warmth. Not yet. But it was change. Carter glanced once more at his watch. 2:43 p.m. Time continued, as it always did. Predictable. Measured. But the moments within it felt different now. Less compressed. More defined. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper, aligning it carefully with the stack, though there was no practical need for the precision. His fingers moved slower than before, not from fatigue, but from intention. Nearby, the young corporal at the second table laughed quietly at something another soldier had said, the sound brief, quickly fading back into the subdued atmosphere. Carter did not turn toward it. His attention remained forward. Present. The next civilian stepped up. A boy, perhaps 16, his posture uncertain, his eyes shifting between Carter and the ground. Carter noticed the way his hands moved, fidgeting slightly, as if unsure where to rest. He asked the first question, his voice even. The boy answered in broken English, the words uneven but understandable. Carter did not interrupt. He did not correct. He let the boy finish. When he did, Carter gave a small nod, writing down the response. Exactly as it was given, without adjustment. The boy exhaled softly, a breath he had been holding without realizing it, and stepped forward to the next station. Carter watched him go for a brief moment, then returned to the table. The papers remained in order. The process remained intact. But the weight of each interaction had changed. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just acknowledged. He picked up his glove again, turning it slightly in his hand, feeling the dampness that had settled into the leather. Then, without urgency, he set it aside once more. He did not need it. Not right now. The road beyond the checkpoint stretched forward, quieter than before, the earlier line now dispersed into distance. Carter lifted his gaze toward it, not searching for anyone in particular, just observing the movement as it unfolded naturally. People walking. Pausing. Continuing. Each carrying something unseen, something unspoken. He lowered his gaze back to the table. Another form. Another name waiting to be written. He placed his hand flat against the paper for a brief second, as if grounding himself in the moment. Then he looked up again, his voice steady, familiar, but carrying a depth that had not been there before. Next. By the time the last few civilians approached the checkpoint, the sky had begun to clear in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the day itself had decided to step back and observe what remained. The clouds thinned, allowing a pale, quiet light to settle over the broken rooftops and damp road, softening the edges of everything it touched. Carter stood in the same place, the same posture, the same uniform, but the weight of the afternoon had changed the way he occupied the space. Not visibly. Not in a way that could be reported or explained. Just in the way he paused before speaking, and the way he allowed each answer to fully exist before moving on. A woman approached, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, held carefully in both hands. She answered his questions in short German phrases, her voice low, almost blending into the air. Carter listened. Not for translation. For meaning. When the translator spoke, repeating her words in English, Carter did not look at him. He kept his attention on the woman, watching the way her fingers adjusted the cloth slightly as she spoke, the way her shoulders remained steady despite the uncertainty in her voice. He wrote her information down slowly, each letter deliberate, then looked up again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a small nod. She returned it, almost imperceptibly, and moved on. The exchange was brief. Routine. And yet it lingered. Carter placed the paper down with care, aligning it with the others, though no one would notice if it were slightly off. He glanced toward the road again, not searching this time, just observing the steady movement of people finding their way forward. The town remained quiet, but not empty. Life, in its quietest form, was still present. A cart rolled slowly in the distance, its wooden wheels moving through shallow puddles with a soft, rhythmic sound. Somewhere, a door opened and closed. Small sounds. Ordinary. Grounding. The next person stepped forward, then the next. Each interaction followed the same structure, but none felt identical. Carter noticed details he would have missed hours earlier. A hesitation before a name. A glance toward the sky. The way someone held their breath before answering. He did not comment on these things. He did not change the questions. But he allowed them space. As the line came to an end, the checkpoint grew still. No more footsteps approaching. No more papers being handed forward. Just the quiet presence of the tent, the table, the road stretching beyond. Carter looked down at his hands. Bare. Resting lightly against the surface of the table. The gloves remained where he had left them, darkened by the rain, untouched since. He picked one up, turning it slowly, feeling the weight of the damp leather in his palm. Then he set it back down again. Not because he forgot. Because he chose not to. He stepped slightly out from under the edge of the tent, allowing the faint sunlight to reach him. It was not warm, but it was different from the shade. The air felt clearer. He took a breath, deeper than before, then let it out slowly. Across the road, the last figures from the earlier line had nearly disappeared into the distance, their forms blending into the quiet landscape. Carter watched for a moment, then lowered his gaze back to the checkpoint. Everything remained in place. The structure. The order. The expectation of how things were supposed to be done. And yet something within that structure had shifted, quietly, without announcement. He returned to the table, placing his hand on the stack of completed forms, pressing them lightly as if to confirm their presence. Then he lifted his head once more, his voice calm, steady, unchanged in tone, but carrying a depth that had not been there at the start of the day. "We are done here." The equipment was packed with the same precision it had been set up, each movement deliberate, each item returned to its place as if nothing unusual had occurred. The table was cleared. The papers were stacked and secured. The canvas edges were tightened against a breeze that had begun to move more freely through the open road. Soldiers worked quietly, their motions efficient, practiced, familiar. Carter moved among them without giving instructions, without needing to. He picked up the last remaining form, glanced at it briefly, then slid it into the folder with the others. The sound was soft. Final. He reached for his gloves again, lifting them from the table, feeling the cool dampness that had settled into the leather. For a moment he held them without putting them on, his gaze drifting past the checkpoint, toward the road that now stood empty. The civilians were gone. The line had dissolved into distance. Only the faint traces of their presence remained, footprints fading into the drying earth, small disturbances in the surface of a place that would soon return to stillness. Carter stepped away from the table, moving beyond the edge of the tent, his boots pressing lightly into the ground that had softened from the earlier rain. The sky above had cleared further now, revealing a pale blue that had not been visible all afternoon. It did not feel like a new day. Just a continuation, quieter than before. He stopped near the edge of the road, looking out over the stretch of land that led through the town and beyond it. The buildings remained broken. The silence remained present. But there was movement, somewhere far off, barely visible, a figure walking steadily along the path that curved away from the checkpoint. He recognized the pace before he recognized the person. Measured. Unhurried. As if the world could move around it without changing it. Anna Weiss did not turn. She did not look back. She continued forward, her steps even, her posture unchanged, her presence gradually blending into the distance until she became part of the landscape itself. Carter stood still, watching for a moment longer than he had any reason to. Then he lowered his gaze to the gloves in his hands. He turned them once, feeling the weight, the texture, the quiet reminder of something that had shifted without force, without demand. He slipped one glove on slowly, then paused before putting on the other. His hand remained bare for a second longer, exposed to the cool air, to the faint warmth of the light that had finally broken through. Then he put the second glove on. Not as before. Not automatically. With intention. Behind him, a soldier called out that the transport truck was ready. Carter gave a short nod without turning, his attention still lingering on the road ahead. Then he turned back toward the checkpoint, his steps steady, his posture unchanged, yet carrying something that had not been there when the day began. He moved past the table, now empty, past the tent, now quiet, and toward the waiting vehicle. As he reached it, he placed one hand briefly against the side of the metal frame, feeling its solid, familiar surface. Grounded. Certain. He climbed in, taking his seat without urgency. The engine started with a low, steady hum, the sound filling the space where voices had once been. The vehicle began to move, slowly at first, then with more certainty, rolling forward along the same road the civilians had taken. Carter looked ahead, not searching, not expecting to see anything in particular. The road stretched forward, open, quiet, unchanged. And yet, as the vehicle moved, the space between one moment and the next felt different. Wider. More deliberate. As if something unseen had settled into place. He adjusted his gloves once, the leather now warmer against his skin, no longer damp. Then he rested his hands still, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. The road continued. The town remained behind. And the silence, no longer empty, moved with him. The truck moved steadily along the narrow road, its tires pressing into the damp earth with a soft, rhythmic sound that blended into the quiet of the afternoon. The town receded behind them, not suddenly, but gradually, each broken structure fading into distance until it became part of the horizon rather than something separate from it. Carter sat facing forward, his posture unchanged, his hands resting lightly against his knees, the leather of his gloves now dry, shaped once again to the contours of his fingers. Around him, the other soldiers spoke in low voices, fragments of conversation rising and falling without drawing his attention. He heard them, but did not follow them. His focus remained ahead, fixed not on a specific point, but on the space the road created as it stretched forward. The landscape opened slightly beyond the town, fields appearing on either side, uneven and quiet, marked by the absence of movement more than anything else. A fence line ran along one edge, its posts leaning at slight angles, connected by wire that sagged in gentle curves. The sky above was clearer now, the pale blue expanding, uninterrupted, carrying no urgency, no demand. Carter shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the angle of his shoulders as the truck moved over a shallow dip in the road. The motion was subtle, but enough to remind him of the weight of his body, of the presence he occupied within the space. He glanced briefly to his right, where the land sloped downward into a narrow ditch filled with rainwater, its surface still, reflecting the light without distortion. Then he looked forward again. The road curved ahead, bending gently to the left, disappearing behind a line of trees that stood thin and tall, their branches bare in places, their leaves sparse. As the truck approached the curve, Carter leaned forward slightly, not out of urgency, but out of attention. The driver slowed just enough to navigate the turn, the engine lowering its pitch, the tires adjusting to the shift in direction. And then, just beyond the curve, he saw her again. Anna Weiss walked along the side of the road, her figure smaller now than before, but unmistakable in the way she moved. Measured. Unhurried. The same pace. The same quiet control. She carried nothing visible in her hands, her coat still resting lightly on her shoulders, now drying in the softened air. She did not step aside immediately. She continued forward, aware of the vehicle approaching, but not reacting to it with urgency or hesitation. The driver eased the truck slightly to the left, giving her space without comment. Carter watched as they drew closer, his gaze steady, not calling out, not signaling. Just observing. As they passed, Anna turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence of the truck, her eyes moving toward it without searching for anyone in particular. For a fraction of a second, their gazes aligned. No recognition was spoken. No gesture was made. Just a moment. Clear. Undisturbed. Then the truck moved past her, continuing forward along the road, the distance between them re-establishing itself with each rotation of the wheels. Carter did not turn to look back. He kept his gaze forward, allowing the moment to settle without holding onto it. The road stretched ahead once more, unchanged, quiet, consistent. He adjusted his gloves again, a small, habitual motion, then let his hands rest. Around him, the low conversation of the other soldiers continued, the world resuming its ordinary rhythm. But within that rhythm, something remained. Not visible. Not spoken. Just present. As steady as the road itself. The road stretched on without interruption, a quiet line drawn through a landscape that no longer resisted change, only absorbed it. The truck maintained its steady pace, the engine low and consistent, a sound that filled the spaces between thought rather than interrupting them. Carter remained still, his gaze fixed ahead, but not in the same way as before. He was no longer scanning. No longer anticipating. He was simply present. The fields on either side grew wider as they moved. Farther from the town, the broken structures replaced by open land that carried a different kind of silence. Not the silence of damage. The silence of distance. A wind moved across the grass, subtle but visible in the way it bent the taller strands, creating a shifting pattern that traveled slowly from one end of the field to the other. Carter noticed it. Before, it would have been background. Now it held shape. The truck passed a narrow wooden bridge, its planks worn but intact, the tires producing a brief, hollow sound as they crossed. Then the road continued, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. One of the soldiers beside him said something about the next checkpoint, about schedules, about timing. Carter heard the words, but they did not settle. They moved past him, like the landscape outside, present for a moment, then gone. He adjusted his posture slightly, leaning back just enough to feel the support of the seat behind him. His hands remained still, resting against his knees, the leather of his gloves now fully dry, carrying no trace of the rain that had once marked them. Yet he remembered it. Not as a detail. As a shift. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that only becomes clear in contrast to what came before. The truck slowed briefly as another curve approached, this one broader, opening the view ahead rather than narrowing it. Beyond it, the land stretched farther than before, a long, uninterrupted line of road cutting through open space. And for a moment, there was nothing else. No people. No structures. Just distance. Carter leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to focus on the far end of the road. Not searching. Just observing. The driver did not speak. The soldiers remained quiet. Even the engine seemed softer, as if it understood the need for less. The moment passed, as all moments do, and the truck continued forward, the rhythm returning, steady, predictable. Carter exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding. He lifted one hand briefly, adjusting the edge of his glove, smoothing the seam along his fingers with a small, precise motion. Then he let his hand rest again. The road ahead remained unchanged, but the way he moved through it had altered in a way no map could record. He was still the same man. The same rank. The same responsibility. But the space between instruction and understanding had widened. And in that space, something quieter had taken hold. The truck moved on, the horizon steady, the distance unfolding without urgency. And Carter, without shifting his posture, without speaking a word, allowed himself to follow it, not as a task, not as a duty, but as something to be seen. By the time the sun lowered toward the horizon, the light had softened into something quieter, stretching long across the road and the fields beyond it, turning every shadow into a slow extension of what stood before it. The truck continued forward, but the urgency that had once defined movement was no longer present. It was no longer about reaching the next point. It was about moving through what was already there. Carter remained seated, his posture unchanged, his hands still resting where they had been, but his gaze carried a different kind of attention now. Not sharp. Not searching. Just aware. The land around them had opened completely, the remnants of the town now far behind, replaced by fields that rolled gently under the fading light. The sky held a pale gold near the horizon, blending upward into a calm blue that no longer carried the weight of the earlier storm. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It simply was. The truck slowed as they approached a small outpost, little more than a wooden barrier and a single standing post with a lantern that had not yet been lit. A soldier stepped forward, exchanging brief words with the driver, routine, efficient, without delay. Carter listened, not to the words themselves, but to the tone. The steadiness. The familiarity. The absence of tension. The barrier lifted, and the truck moved on. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had been altered in a way that left no visible trace. Carter shifted slightly, turning his head just enough to glance toward the side of the road once more. The path behind them was no longer visible, but he did not need to see it. He remembered it. Not as a sequence of events. As a moment. A single point where something had paused, and in that pause something had shifted. He looked down at his hands, the leather of his gloves now fully dry, fitting naturally once again, as if they had always been that way. But he knew they had not. He knew there had been a moment when they were set aside. When the space between action and reaction had widened just enough to allow something else to enter. He flexed his fingers once, slowly, then let them rest again. The truck came to a stop at the edge of a larger encampment, tents arranged in ordered rows, their outlines softened by the evening light. Soldiers moved through the space with quiet purpose, their silhouettes steady, their voices low, blending into the background rather than rising above it. Carter stepped down from the vehicle, his boots meeting the ground with a soft, controlled impact. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply stepped into the next part of the day as it unfolded. A soldier approached, offering a brief report, outlining the schedule for the evening, the expectations for the next morning. Carter listened, nodding once, the information received without resistance. When the soldier finished, Carter gave a short acknowledgement, then moved past him, walking between the rows of tents. The ground was dry here, the earlier rain not reaching this distance, the air carrying only a faint trace of moisture. He stopped near the edge of the camp, where the land opened once more, the horizon visible beyond the final line of tents. The sun rested just above it now, a thin line of light separating sky from earth. Carter stood there for a moment, not long, not marked by any outward change, just present within the space he occupied. The sounds of the camp continued behind him. The movement. The structure. The order. All unchanged. But within that order, something had settled. Something quieter than command. Something steadier than routine. He turned back toward the camp, his steps even, his posture the same, his role unchanged. But the way he moved within it had shifted, not in action, but in awareness. And as the last light of the day lowered beyond the horizon, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It carried weight. It carried meaning. Not spoken. Not explained. Just held. And somewhere within that silence, a standard had been set, not by force, not by instruction, but by something far quieter. Something that did not need to be repeated to remain. In the quiet aftermath of World War II, a German civilian woman and an American officer crossed paths at a temporary checkpoint, where routine meets something far less expected. What begins as a simple exchange of questions becomes a subtle shift in perception, as the officer realizes that the woman understands far more than he assumed, and more importantly, that she has chosen silence until the exact moment it mattered. This story unfolds not through dramatic conflict but through stillness, observation, and the quiet weight of dignity, revealing how even in the structured environment of military order, a single moment of clarity can reshape the way one man sees the people in front of him. As the day progresses and the checkpoint clears, the American officer carries that moment with him, not as a memory of words spoken, but as a change in how he listens, how he pauses, and how he allows space between action and understanding, through restrained storytelling and cinematic pacing. This narrative explores the unseen emotional shifts that define the most powerful WWII stories, where transformation happens not through force but through awareness. The German civilian woman does not argue, does not resist, and does not seek attention, yet her presence alters the rhythm of the officer's decisions, reminding him that humanity is not something granted, but something recognized. As the journey continues beyond the checkpoint and into the open road, the officer encounters her once more, not as a subject to be processed, but as a person moving forward with quiet certainty, reinforcing the idea that the most impactful WWII stories are often the ones that unfold in silence. This immersive narrative reflects the essence of WWII stories that focus on internal change rather than external conflict, offering a perspective rooted in realism, restraint, and emotional authenticity. By the end, nothing outward has changed, yet everything within the officer has shifted, illustrating how the most enduring WWII stories are not about what was said or done, but about what was understood. In this carefully crafted piece, the German civilian woman and the American officer embody the quiet power of presence, proving that even in a world defined by orders and expectations, the smallest moment can redefine the standard, making this one of those rare WWII stories that lingers long after the final scene fades. Character 1, 26-year-old white German civilian woman, slim build, pale skin, light blonde hair tied back, wearing a worn gray coat and simple dress, calm expression, direct front-facing view, natural lighting, subtle emotion, realistic World War II setting, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.